Hello everyone. Hopefully everyone's well fed and nourished. We've got a fantastic lineup coming up now. So we'll kick it off with Mr. Pip Jenkinson. So Pip works for Biden Solutions. So Biden Solutions is a information security and technical solutions firm serving both state and federal government and also private enterprises in Australia. Based in Queensland, they are proudly Indigenous owned, reinvesting into their local community, regional communities, and help to bridge that gap that we have in IT. Personally, on a personal note, I think this is absolutely fantastic initiative, and I think it's one that we need a lot more of. So I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing from Pip, who's going to talk around Indigenous and ICT. Well, without further ado, we'll bring Pip to the stage. And you don't want to see me anymore. Bye.
Okay, guys. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I'll take that as a yes. This is the first time I've done this on this. Any mistakes that I make, I'm just going to try and do the very best I can. Okay, so I was asked to speak on this subject. This subject is very dear to my heart. I'll just give you an understanding of where this drive comes from, because it is a little bit unusual for a non-Indigenous man to be as passionate about this as I am. About 2 years ago, my dad passed away. He was married to my mum for 56 years. He produced 3 beautiful boys. We all stayed out of jail, so I think he's done a very good job there. But for all the wonderful things that he was also a smoker, and so it came to no surprise that Dad passed away from stage 4 lung cancer about 2 years ago. And one of the things that Dad drove home to the 3 boys was this concept of legacy. Son, leave the world in a better place than when you found it. And you know, I was really passionate about IT security. I've been involved in the industry for 10 years. And like, you know, an event where something as cataclysmic as a parent passing away, it really caused me to stop and just have a little bit of a sanity check and introspection of what I was doing in the industry and why, you know, a way I could be responsible of creating a positive legacy. And I started on this journey of it was just before the World Cup, and we started on the journey of being able to rattle off with relative uninterruption notable First Nations sporting stars, right? And it was across the board. It wasn't just rugby union, Curtly Beale. It was rugby league, and it was AFL, and it was tennis, and it was, you know, you start looking into it. There's horse racing and there's darts champions. Then I started to extrapolate that out and looked at music and activism and politics and education and law, and I could find instances of really, really cool First Nations, not just at a representation, but at an international standard. And then I came to look at my own industry. And I was really ashamed to say that after 10 years of working in IT security, both from a vendor and a reseller, and having touched some fairly large accounts in federal and state government, that I couldn't name an Indigenous pen tester or First Nations SOC manager. Laurie, I know you're on the call. I hope what I tell you can identify with. I couldn't name until finding Laurie an Indigenous CISO, let alone a CIO. And I thought that, you know, thankfully my ignorance has been lifted, and now I can name and identify men and women who identify as being First Nations in our sector. And I just think there needs to be more of them. I think that our society and our industry needs to work harder at producing these role models. So with that as a backdrop to why I'm talking about what I'm talking about, then I'll crack on. So in keeping with the theme, kryptonite for me is barriers to Indigenous inclusion and diversity in IT security. I'm going to keep it short and sharp and punchy. I'm going to limit it to 9 slides. So rather than list an agenda and just read off my PowerPoints, there's going to be lots of talking. I'm going to try and keep my eye on the chat screen. So if there is a question, please type it in. Or if you allow me to rattle through this, I'll answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. So What does want to ask you, men and women on the call, like, do you guys think that we have a problem? I mean, I certainly do, but I've done a bit of research on this. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I've got some answers, and I wanted to ask you if we had a problem. And a way that I've articulated this in the past is just to ask yourself this question, right? And I get you to do it virtually, but could you just stop for a moment and think of an Indigenous, right, that you can name and picture the face? And for those of you who can't think of an Indigenous sports star, I'll just throw a name out there: Ash Barty or Anthony Mundine, or Jonathan Thurston. Okay, so now we've got that picture of that smiling face in our brain. Well, I'm going to virtually ask you to put both hands in the air and say, right, now keep your hands in the air if you can think of an Indigenous man or woman who you've worked with in IT who identifies as being First Nations. And I'd ask you, everyone on the call, to ask themselves the same question, except now if we can think of IT being the data, security being the bullseye, ask yourself this: how many men and women have you bumped into in your career, or even the last 12 months, that have identified as being First Nations in IT security? And I think, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, but I think that the answers will be in single digits, if not zero. And so I think that there is a problem. So yeah, we've got a problem, and the problem comes from what we've just played out there: stereotypes, right? Pigeonholing First Nations men and women into sport is a very, very dangerous pigeonhole, and it starts to put these beautifully talented and creative human beings into little pigeonholes of what they can and can't do to be successful. And sport certainly is one of those ones. And it's a problem that the US is experiencing over there as well. It's something that we need to be conscious and cognizant of addressing here in Australia. Workplace culture, lack of role models, supply diversity. I'll pull these apart in a moment. Financial constraints, educational gaps, reliable access to technology, ignorance, supply chain diversity, supply chain consolidation, and fear. We've touched on stereotypes. Workplace culture is a big one, and reconciliation action plans, which I'll extrapolate on a little bit on this call, is definitely a barrier to inclusion. Certainly, there are some sectors in the workplace, or some categories in the workplace where First Nations men and women feel more welcome than others. And by consulting with traditional owners on Yugambeh land and Yaga and Turrbal, where I live, we can identify that some of those workplaces are the traditional, or what would be referred to as traditional Indigenous occupations, things like arts and tourism and hospitality and cultural events, and indeed sport. So we have to really work hard around the culture that we're exuding to potential employees. A lack of role models. So we're bouncing around town saying that we want to create the first JT of IT. I bumped into a wonderful young lady in procurement recently, and she asked me why I was so focused on creating the first Justin Timberlake of IT, and I said no, it was the wrong JT. The reason why we wanted to pick that man out in particular was that there is a guy that represents everything that's wholesome and good about sport, culture, mob, business, philanthropy, looking after his children, looking after his family, clean living, identity choices, all of these things that personified in this pin-up boy for aspiring Indigenous sports stars. Who do you want to be like when you grow up? I want to be like JT. I want to be like Mark Ella. I want to be like Sammy Thaiday. And I think that, with the exception of a couple of people on this call specifically here, that there is a distinct lack of role models at that CISO level. Supply diversity, which is really important, because if we don't diversify our supply chain, then it's sort of like the $1 million question: how can we encourage it perceived as being an inclusive sector when our supply chain is literally either all white, or there are no women-owned business, or there's no veterans business. I'm a veteran myself, and perhaps there's no Australian disability enterprise businesses in your supply chain. So it's not just about Indigenous, but for the purpose of today's conversation, it certainly will be. Financial constraints is something that I'm very passionate about. We understand that what makes a candidate, or sorry, what can make a candidate particularly attractive for employment in a SOC team are these international certifications. I can assure you, after paying for a number of them, they are not cheap. And I put it to you guys that a SANS incident response handling course, which would make any graduate, but if we're just going to focus on Indigenous graduates, an Indigenous graduate from university who then has a SANS incident response handling course under her wing would make her more attractive for employment. So there is a financial constraint that I think our industry plays a lot of importance on those C acronyms, and anything from AusCERT and anything from SANS. Educational gaps, so the two are linked there, between the industry and the certifications and what we're asking of our graduates when they come through uni or through TAFE or through high school. We're asking them to know more, to be more certified. Access to technology. So certainly out west, you know, in remote regional communities across Australia, there is a barrier to this idea about regular uninterrupted internet. Now, I certainly can't provide a solution for that. In fact, the three things that I wanted to speak about today were financial constraints, educational constraints, and social constraints. There's a little bit of ignorance there around, you know, what I think people in general can do, and supply chain consolidation. And this is working very closely with chief procurement officers and understanding that what these men and women are taught at university and what we are proposing around supply chain diversity, it's almost it's sort of like a flip of the coin, where we would traditionally think that supply chain consolidation is all about cost savings, reducing risk, and providing benefits for the organisation. Counter that with supplier diversity, which is also about being a more corporately responsible citizen, being more representative of the community in which we operate, that we support. And the final one for me is fear. And this is my opinion, and I'm happy to be challenged on it in a nice way. Please don't be mean. That sometimes I think, having done this for a little while, sometimes I think that there is a general fear in the community and in corporate and private sector. The fear of saying the wrong thing paralyzes people to say nothing at all, or the fear of doing the wrong thing and being reprimanded paralyzes people from doing anything at all. And I think that paralysis is almost as bad as the, you know, what was going to be said. And the way it was described to me was that if something is said or something is done and it's coming from sort of a point of uneducation or benevolent ignorance, it's not as bad as just sort of sticking your head in the sand and pretending that we don't have a problem, and there's a fear of putting your hand up to say, listen, boss, I don't agree with that. Can we do something different? That's what I mean about fear. So is it really a problem in Australia in ITC security in 2020? And we just bring you back to that original statement that I have done before, both here in Queensland and down in Melbourne, in large audiences, where we just play that little game about, you know, identifying men and women who we've worked with. So yeah, mate, I think it absolutely is, and there are two main reasons. It's social and economic. So the advantages of what we're talking about are not just the warm fuzzy feelings that we get from doing something that is fair, you know, just and morally correct. You know, ask any of the CEOs of an ASX listed organisation, and they'll be proudly beating chests and saying, yeah, we're all about creating diverse organisations. You know, they might point to their inclusion policy or the diverse people in their workplace and support of local communities. You know, indeed, 3 out of the Fortune 500 companies now employ a chief diversity officer. But there remains a critical area that every organisation needs to focus on, and it's their supply chain. Over the last few years, supply diversity has gained a significant amount of traction to become one of the largest trends in enterprise procurement. And this is reflected in some of the stuff that we're seeing, having worked closely with Supply Nation and Reconciliation Action Plans Australia, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So organisations like, and it's not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. There are thousands of organisations that do this, but you know, the big four banks, Rio, BHP, Flight Centre, Bank of Queensland, you know, some of the vendors who are sharing this call with us now are looking at all this, but they've made massive investments in supply diversity. Because I think today's organisations need to think a little bit differently about their supply chain, procurement, corporate social responsibility programs, and how the three are intricately interwoven. Apologies. I believe that those who do this and pay attention to CSR programs will have an opportunity to change the world in ways that, you know, our predecessors couldn't have never imagined. And I also believe that those that don't change will be left behind. Excuse me, just whilst I blow my nose. I don't have COVID. Simply understood, supply diversity is about your supply chain and the suppliers that constitute this chain. And to achieve supply diversity, organisations must be accepting and open to changing their supply chain to make it more inclusive. And an inclusive supply chain just doesn't start and stop with Indigenous business. We'd be talking about certainly Indigenous owned businesses. We'd also be talking about women owned businesses, veteran owned businesses, Australian disability enterprise owned businesses, and indeed social enterprises. And why is it important that we focus on these guys? Well, I think it's quite simple. These businesses are typically disadvantaged for being different. They can be discriminated against because of their differences. But by supporting these organisations, there's a valuable opportunity to promote growth of local communities, to strengthen the economy, and to provide more opportunities for individuals and businesses, and indeed the nation, to grow and prosper. So that's what's at risk if we do nothing. And I think that if we do something, the advantages are pretty compelling. So a lot of people sit back and wait for the government to do something. It's but after working very closely with the government when we kicked this business off, we flew down and spoke to some ministers, and refreshingly, the uniform feedback to us when we flew down as a consortium to talk about Indigenous business was the government's role was to be a better customer. And indeed, there was a quote there from the then Cyber Minister. If we want to transform the entrepreneurial or digital government sector in Australia, the most important thing we can do is to be a better customer. You know, I believe that the government's role is to embrace the federally mandated procurement policies and to enforce at a state level those state-based procurement objectives. And then for individuals within those state-based organisations and federally based organisations, their role is to enlighten themselves and to be accountable. And if you look at no one else is looking, just be accountable to yourself. This is the right thing to do on so many levels. It's not just enterprises that are putting the spotlight on supply diversity. The Commonwealth Government has made massive leaps of supply chain diversity through the IPP, through the Indigenous Procurement Policy. The government has set has set its sights to achieve 3% of every government goods and services to be consumed through an Indigenous business by 2020. And to ensure that there is a tangible change to supply diversity from a government perspective, those targets are enforceable. The IPP sets out to create opportunities for Indigenous businesses to grow, to drive demand for goods and services provided by Indigenous businesses, to boost employment, to stimulate new investment into Indigenous businesses. And then there are sometimes the things that we don't think about as a sector, and they're the things like creating intergenerational wealth, so wealth that's handed down through the generations. opportunity employment pathways for kids to follow as they leave uni and they're looking around to potential career opportunities, and starting to look at IT security as a viable career pathway. And I think that there is a great responsibility that the government has. And I also think that by leading by example, it's showing that by including Indigenous businesses in your supply chain can bring around so many benefits. The IPP not only demonstrates right purchasing behaviours from organisations that have a significant amount of money to push down through the supply chain, but it also sends a very powerful message to corporate Australia. And I believe that message is that if all businesses get behind the Australian government's goal, then the markets will grow, economy will thrive, and we will start to see, and it certainly won't happen overnight, and I'm not proposing that there's going to be a tsunami, but there will be a trickle which will grow into a flood of capable Indigenous men and women that will provide those role models for other kids to follow. Interestingly enough, the difference between the two slides between private and public, there's not a great deal of difference, and I think the private sector needs to be a better customer. I think the private sector needs to embrace reconciliation action plans, not just as a tick box. So not just saying I've got a plan, but what am I going to do with that plan? How am I going to use reconciliation action and all those supporting frameworks that reconciliation action plans provide? How am I going to use those for good? How am I going to enforce procurement objectives that support social outcomes? And then from an individual level, how can I educate myself as a private sector employee or someone who buys or procures ITC security goods and services? How can I educate myself and be accountable to not only my business, but also my customers and the community that my business operates in? Our community is diverse. Our customers are diverse. So let's make other parts of the corporate structure diverse. I think that's really important. I'm going to steal a quote from the chairperson of Supply Nation. Supply Nation, by the way, is a not-for-profit organisation with the purpose of providing opportunities for small to medium enterprise Indigenous businesses to enter into commercial relationships with large corporate and government entities. Indigenous businesses certified with Supply Nation can get a lot of support from this organisation. And as the chairperson of Supply Nation told a newspaper, we educate procurement officers to broaden their minds. Now, if they need high-vis workwear, security services, or everyday purchases like paper, we absolutely have a business, an Indigenous-owned business that we can point you in the direction of. And that then opens up, the idea that Indigenous businesses are not homogenous, and they're not always about culture, community, or sport. They're entrepreneurial, they're pioneering, they're innovative. They come with a different way of looking at a problem. An old problem, new sets of eyes. So I think this idea about, and I keep labouring on the point about supply diversity, because whilst Batem Solutions represents Queensland's first and only Supply Nation certified IT security consultancy, there must be 50 or 60 non-Indigenous IT security consultancies. And so I'm proposing that if the sector in Queensland can support those 60 and one of ours, then it just goes to show that, well, there should be 10 of us. There should be 10 Indigenous businesses in Queensland all competing for these projects and hopefully putting back into the community. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about and to give you some education around another way of overcoming some of these barriers or kryptonite to what we're trying to do around diversity and inclusion are reconciliation action plans. Now, I'm fairly certain that we're all conscious of the concept of an ISO certification framework is simply a framework for the way that the organisation holds information. Well, reconciliation action plan is simple yet incredibly powerful. It outlines the steps an organisation will need to take to build strong relationships and respect there's a key word there, respect, between non-Indigenous people and First Nations Australians. And it lays down a framework for tangible social change. In fact, a recent report shows that reconciliation action plans are helping to close the gap in employment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. A RAP plan, and I'll share the links with you at the end of this speech, but the RAP plan helps to create more dynamic and diverse workplace, which is a more understanding and therefore more tolerant and tolerant of different cultures, which can only be a good thing for Australia, right? If we're just a more tolerant in our workplace. And I think that ICT will start to present itself as a more inclusive environment for First Nations participation. So what's the bloody solution to all this kryptonite talk? Because I do find that a lot of people talk and there's not a lot of action, and that's why a couple of slides ago we had a quick chat about sometimes people wait for the government to mandate something and then we'll do it. Now, please don't be that person that waits for something to be mandated before it becomes bloody common sense. The same concept about getting in your car and putting your seatbelt on because it's common sense. That's where we want to get to, and it's going to need a combined effort of everybody in the sector, from the reseller to the vendor that we represent, to the customers, to the disties. We all need to come together and act as these superheroes for diversity and inclusion. In keeping with the theme, we can all be superheroes, and yes, we can. We can all be superheroes if we just do the little things right. We don't need to, rattle the cage and put our employment at risk by, challenging the status quo. But certainly, from our perspective, as being an innovative partner to state and federal government and the ASX Top 100, we know only full well that we are challenging the status quo in procurement and in technical teams. But it's just really wonderful when customers and decision makers just give us a go, because that, in my mind, is being a superhero. It's just saying, we'll give you a go and we won't assess you on your culture or the culture of the people you represent. We will assess you on your capability. And I think that is what we all want as human beings, just to be assessed on our capability, whether you're black or white, gay or straight, regardless of your religious beliefs. Just, can you do the job that we're being asked of you? Yes. Is it within the budget envelope? Yes. Do you have all the appropriate insurances and that we need to give ourselves some comfort that you guys can cover us? Yes, we can. Do you have some references? Yes. Well, then instead of asking why Indigenous business to provide the outcome, I'd kind of flip it on its head and I'd say, well, perhaps we should be asking ourselves as a sector, why not? Well, why not? The government's leading the way, and in some of their procurement policies, certainly from a New South Wales government perspective and a Victorian government perspective, in black and white, it's in the procurement policy that is reported on at a state-based level to say services that you're after as a procurement professional. If the certain goods and services can be found from an Indigenous business first, then you don't need to test the market. In fact, you're well within your rights to start commercial negotiations with that Indigenous supplier. Now think about that for a moment, about this idea about, in IT security, getting, and from a CISO's perspective and a CIO's perspective, getting the security control that you want today to fix the problem that exists today, not in 3 months' time once a testing the market process has happened and once we've evaluated through quotes from 15 different suppliers. We want a control to fit now. There aren't many organisations in Australia that can effectively navigate some of the procurement processes whilst supporting and encouraging probity every step of the way. There aren't too many organisations that can do this, that are welcome with open arms in state and federal government, other than Indigenous business providers of goods and services. And in this instance, we're talking about security. So in my mind, growing up as a young boy, in my mind, superheroes were always supportive, kind, patient, knowledgeable, and just like Clark Kent, they did the right thing even when no one was looking. So I firmly believe that, excuse me, that in many years to come, we will have an IT sector that is so supportive of Indigenous inclusion and diversity that many of the superheroes that have picked up the challenge today, and I hope that many of you do, will pass on that cape and mask to the next generation of superheroes. So we get to a stage where this idea about diversity and inclusion doesn't take a cognitive thought process. It just happens. I think that would be a wonderful place for us all to be. For those of you who are interested, I can share. Sorry, that concludes the formal process of the chat. I wanted to share some links with you, if you are interested, links to Supply Nation and what that organisation represents, to reconciliation.org.au. Certainly from a state-based perspective, I'm well versed in Queensland government policy, but I can guide people towards the state-based. If you are a state-based procurement professional or a state-based security guy, I can guide you towards some of the beautifully written procurement policies that set out to create a fairer and more equitable society. They've been well written, and sometimes I think their beauty is in their simplicity. I'd also to draw your attention to a program in Canada called Connected North. There's a fantastic program where, like in Australia, First Nations communities are affected by the tyranny of distance, and there has been a vendor collaborate with the Canadian government to create a program called Connected North. And through technology, we are starting to bridge the gap and close that gap of distance between First Nations communities in Canada and Labrador and British Columbia. And I just think to myself, guys, if New Zealand can do it and Canada can do it, then why the bloody hell can't we do it? Of course we can. I just think we all need to be, a little bit more superhero and a little bit less, let's just wait for someone else to do it for us. I think we need to all step up. So I'm going to, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to stop sharing something and click on something else.
Cool. Thank you very much for that, Pip. And if there are any questions, please do just throw them in the chat or do throw them in the Q&A section. We do have a little bit of time, but first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you very much, Pip. It's never easy kind of jumping into a presentation very last minute. So on behalf of AusCERT, I'd really like to thank you for that. And I'd like to kind of pick out a point that you made around the paralysis aspect of it. So you're 100% spot on. The fact that I think a lot of people don't know what the right thing to say is or how to go about it, so they don't say anything at all. So I mentioned just before your talk that this topic is quite near and dear to my heart because my partner's Indigenous. So, she's from the Yugambeh Nation on the Gold Coast and around Logan. And, her father's an elder and all that kind of stuff. So he's involved quite heavily in the community. So on the paralysis perspective, not everyone's as fortunate as I personally am to just go up to her and ask a question. It might be stupid, and most likely is, but not everyone is fortunate enough to go up and have a person on hand, through which they can ask those types of questions. So my question to you would be, what would be the appropriate approach, or are there any kind of mechanisms out there that people can ask those questions without feeling a little bit silly, or maybe feel like they are naive?
Yeah, oh mate, look, and thank you for the vote of confidence, and thank you for the little story. I deliberately finished a little bit early so we could have these open discussions. So, so my go-to guy is Mark Ella, AM. I have the ability, and I'm fortunate enough to if I have a thought process or a thought bubble that I just want to reference check with someone who has. So Mark Eller, if members on the call don't know, was the first Indigenous captain of the Wallabies back in the late 70s and early 80s. Rugby union. He wrenched the Bledisloe Cup back off the Kiwis in 1981, the first time since 1947. He was inducted into the Rugby Hall of Fame. He retired from rugby union when he was 25. And he played, and the three boys, Ella boys, played in an era where racism was open. And so Mark now is the executive director of SBS Sports Over the Black Dot, NITV. And he's all about creating role models outside of sport, because he knows that not everyone is gifted at sport as the Ella family. But to answer your question succinctly, so I'm fortunate, like you, of having that go-to guy that we just ask a question over a phone call and say, mate, is this the right way of framing it, or is it not? I think that there's two things that we could probably look at. I think the first one is I genuinely believe that there is such a profound sense of ignorance when it comes to these subjects that I think that every organisation needs to invest in cultural sensitivity training. I think that we need to really understand what it is that First Nations people bring to this to the sector. That's the first thing. That's a formal approach, right, where we educate ourselves to break down those that ignorance that's up here. The next thing is up to the individual, and this is the concept that if we do good, only good will follow, right? So if we are someone that we know, I mean, I'm certainly not proposing just going up on, to a First Nations man or woman on the street and asking them for their opinion. That's probably not a good idea. But if there is a way that we can communicate, either through volunteering for Indigenous organisations, but I think that there's this concept that I think it's not just Indigenous people, it's men and women in wheelchairs. We don't want to skirt around the issue. We don't want people to feel sorry for us. We don't want people to jump around. Just come out and ask the question. I think if it's coming from a good, if the question itself is coming from a good point of view, or a good what's the word? Good angle, rather than being a malicious question. If it's coming from a sense of, hey, look, I just want to know, I want to be educated, I want to learn, I don't want to be like everybody else, I want to be better, can you help me? Is this the right way of pronouncing Yilgambeh? Is this the right way of giving an acknowledgement of country? What's the difference between an acknowledgement of country and a welcome to country? These are all things that we should know, Australia should know, like hands down. And it should be taught in school. Oh, I hope to God it is. I'm too old now, 44. But I hope to God it is taught in school.
I hope so too. It wasn't taught when I was going through school, and that was a little while ago as well. And a kind of follow-up question as well. Do you see it improving from your perspective, from what you see, particularly in Queensland? Do you see, it actually improving from that perspective? Do you see a lot more Indigenous and First Nations actually wanting to get into information technology or cybersecurity, which is even more niche?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but I see it improving, but very slowly. I'm fortunate enough just to take that veil of ignorance off my head once I started to investigate and consult like you would with elders. I consult with traditional owners from Yilgambeh, and I consult with the Mark Ellers of the world that represent this idea about overcoming diversity and building resilience and never giving up and being a role model for Jonathan Thurston. I think that we have a long way to go. But someone once wiser than me said that if we don't, best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. And if we don't start today, and we've got all of these beautiful policies and procedures in place to support capable Indigenous businesses across a vast array of capability, not just technology, then when are we going to start? And that's a question that we need to ask our customers and our vendors and resellers and the whole community, because it takes a village to raise a child. I'm not proposing that Batum can do this on its own, because it certainly cannot. But in 2 years, for us to be able to provide the first Indigenous supplied scholarship to the University of Queensland, in 2 years, I respectfully lay down the gauntlet to many of my non-Indigenous competitors to say, what are you doing?
Definitely. Well, I have many more questions. I'm sure other people have some questions as well, but we'll kind of run out of time there. But thank you very much, Phillip, and thanks again for jumping in very last minute and a fantastic presentation.
My pleasure, Lucas. It's lovely to see you, mate.